Hi, everybody. We're here on Chapter 7 of Sideways Stories from Wayside School by Louis Sachar. Calvin. Calvin had a big, round face. Calvin, said Miss Jules, I want you to take this note to Miss Zarves for me. Miss Zarves? Asked Calvin. Yes, Miss Zarves, said Mrs. Jules. You know where she is, don't you? Yes, said Calvin. She's on the 19th story. That's right, Calvin, said Miss Jules. Take it to her. Calvin didn't move. Well, what are you waiting for? Asked Miss Jules. She's on the 19th story, said Calvin. Yes, we have already established that fact, said Miss Jules. The 19th story, Calvin repeated. Yes, Calvin, the 19th story, said Miss Jules. Now take it to her before I lose my patience. But Miss Jules, said Calvin. Now, Calvin, said Miss Jules, unless you would rather go home on the kindergarten bus. Yes, ma'am, said Calvin. Slowly he walked out the door. Ha, 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 laughed Terence. Take it to the 19th story. Give it to Miss Zarves, hooted Myron. Have fun on the 19th story, called Jason. Calvin stood outside the door to the classroom. He didn't know where to go. As you know, when the builder built Wayside School, he accidentally built it sideways, but he also forgot to build the 19th story. Remember that story in this case means floor, so the 19th floor. He didn't build it. He built the 18th and the 20th, but no 19th. He said he was very sorry. There was also no Miss Zarves. Miss Zarves taught the class on the 19th story. Since there was no 19th story, there was no Miss Zarves. And besides that, as if Calvin didn't have enough problems, there was no note. Miss Jules had never given Calvin the note. What do you think is happening with this teacher? Miss Jules doesn't seem like she's very smart, right? It's kind of a concern. And besides that, if Calvin didn't have enough problems, there was no note. Okay. Miss Jules had never given Calvin the note. Boy, this is just great, thought Calvin. Just great. I'm supposed to take a note that I don't have to a teacher who doesn't exist and who teaches on a story or a floor that was never built. He didn't know what to do. He walked down to the 18th story, then back up to the 20th, then back down to the 18th, and back up again to the 20th. There was no 19th story. There never was a 19th story, and there never will be a 19th story. Calvin walked down to the administration office. He decided to put the note in Miss Zarves' mailbox, but there wasn't one of those either. That didn't bother Calvin too much, however, since he didn't really have a note. He looked out the window and saw Louis, the yard teacher, shooting baskets. Louis will know what to do, he thought. Calvin went outside. Hey, Louis, Calvin called. Hi, Calvin, said Louis. He tossed him the basketball. Calvin dribbled up and took a shot. He missed. Louis tipped it in. Do you want to play a game? Louis asked. I don't have time, said Calvin. I have to deliver a note to Miss Zarves up on the 19th story. Then what are you doing all the way down here? Louis asked. There is no 19th story, said Calvin. And where is Miss Zarves? Asked Louis. There is no Miss Zarves, said Calvin. What are you going to do with the note? Asked Louis. Actually, there is no note. She never gave me one, said Calvin. I understand, said Louis. That's good, said Calvin, because I sure don't. It's very simple, said Louis. You are not supposed to take notes to teachers. You already haven't done it. You don't have a note to take to a teacher that doesn't exist on a floor that doesn't exist. So you're done. Calvin still didn't understand. I'll just have to tell Miss Jules that I couldn't deliver the note, he said. That's good, said Louis. The truth is always best. Besides, I don't think I understand what I said either. Calvin walked back up the 30 flights of stairs to Miss Jules' class. Thank you very much, Calvin, said Miss Jules. Calvin said, but Miss Jules interrupted him. That was a very important note. I'm glad I was able to count on you. Yes, but you see, said Calvin. You delivered the note to Miss Zarves on the 19th story? Asked Jason. How did you do it? What do you mean, how did he do it? Asked Miss Jules. He gave Miss Zarves the note. Some people, Jason, are responsible. But you see, Miss Jules, said Calvin. The note was very important, said Miss Jules. I told Miss Zarves not to meet me for lunch. Don't worry, said Calvin. She won't. Good, said Miss Jules. I have a coffee can full of Tootsie Roll Pops on my desk. Those are lollipops. You may help yourself to one, for being such a good messenger. Thanks, said Calvin, but really, it was nothing. Okay, everyone, this is chapter 8 from Sideways Stories from Wayside School by Louis Sachar. Where have you heard this name, right there, Louis, before? So there's a teacher that comes up in pretty much every chapter whose name is Louis. Can you remember who that is? This author has named one of the characters in the book after himself. It's kind of funny, right? If you write a book, you can name the character after yourself. Okay, chapter 8, Myron. Myron had big ears. He was elected class president. The children in Miss Jewell's class expected him to be a good president. Other presidents were good speakers. Myron was even better. He was a good listener. But he had a problem. He didn't know what a class president was supposed to do, so he asked, "What am I supposed to do?" "It's a difficult job," said Miss Jewell, "but you can do it. You must turn the lights on every morning and turn them off at the end of the day." "What?" asked Myron. "As a class president, you must learn to listen," said Miss Jewell. "I'll repeat myself only one more time. You must turn the lights on every morning." "I heard you the first time," said Myron. "It just doesn't sound like much of a job." "It certainly is," said Miss Jewell. "Without light, I can't teach, and children can't learn. Only you can give us that light. I think it's a very important job." "I guess so," said Myron. He was not convinced. "Here, let me show you how to work a light switch," said Miss Jewell. "I already know how," said Myron. "I've been turning lights on and off all my life." "Very good," said Miss Jewell. "You'll make a fine president." Myron wanted to be the best president ever. But it was such an easy job, he thought, that anybody could do it. When school let out that day, Myron stayed behind. He turned out the lights by flicking the switch down. "Excellent," said Miss Jewell. On his way home, Myron heard a horrible noise. First there was a loud screeching, then a sharp squeal, a roaring engine, and then the very faint sound of a girl crying. Myron ran to see what had happened. Dana was bent over in the middle of the road. "What's the matter?" asked Myron. "My dog, Pugsy, was hit by a car," Dana cried. "Who did it?" asked Myron. "I don't know," Dana sobbed. "They sped away." "Well, that's not important," said Myron. "We've got to try to save Pugsy." Pugsy lay unconscious in the street. Myron carefully picked her up. He carried her 2 miles to the vet. Dana cried at his side. "Don't worry, Dana," said Myron. "She'll be all right." But he really wasn't so sure. He gave Pugsy to the vet, walked Dana home, then walked home himself. Dana was so upset that she forgot to thank him. Myron didn't mind. He thought that was what being class president was all about, helping people. The next morning, before he went to school, Myron went to Dana's house. Pugsy was there. She seemed all right. Dana petted her. Pugsy licked her face. "See, Myron, she's all right," said Dana. "The vet said that you brought her in just in time." "Hi, Pugsy," said Myron. He petted her. Pugsy bit his hand. "I guess she doesn't know you," said Dana. "She was unconscious yesterday when you saved her life." Dana's mother put some medicine and a Band-Aid on Myron's hand. Then she drove the children to school. They were late. They ran up the stairs to Miss Jewell's class. The room was completely dark. "It's about time you got here, Myron," said Miss Jewell. "We have no lights." "Why didn't somebody else just turn them on?" asked Myron. "Because you're class president," said Miss Jewell. "Show Stephen how to work the lights. From now on, he will be class president." Myron showed Stephen how to turn on the lights. He flicked the switch up. At the end of the day, Myron showed Stephen how to turn the lights off. He flicked the switch down. After a week, Stephen finally caught on. He made a good president. The lights were on every morning. Myron, who was president for only a day, was the best president in the history of Wayside School. It's just that nobody knew it.